We know that tenants come at us in all shapes and sizes, but what do we do when we have problems, when they cite problems, usually that are well beyond what is reality? They're just kind of blowing things up. Maybe they're sending you 100 calls, 100 messages a day, and you're not exactly sure how to deal with this. We want to talk about that today, and we're going to start with mold issues. The first thing to remember is that mold is everywhere. We don't live in a desert, unless you're coming to us from El Paso, and I can understand that the climate in El Paso is different than the climate here in Houston. But most Texas counties are not in desert regions. And so mold is everywhere. Even in arid, even in dry climates, you can find traces of mold. The question is all mold harmful? And scientifically, it just isn't. The fact that mold appears on the premises is not in and of itself a health hazard. It's definitely something that you should address, but it's also something that's part of the maintenance of your tenants. If the tenant, for example, has allowed a certain situation to accumulate with mold and has failed to mention this to you, they're partly to blame for this problem. And so you'll want to know that when you are handing over keys first to your tenant, that you've handed over a stellar product, that you've inspected it and you know for sure there are no leaks anywhere, there is no presence of mold, you can't detect it by smell or sight. And so when you hand over the unit, you've handed over a clean unit to your tenant. But what happens if they call in a panic and say, oh my gosh, I see mold in the bathroom, which is a pretty common thing for mold complaints to come from the bathroom. But generally speaking, this is mildew. And these kinds of things can be taken care of with simple cleaning. But that's not always the case. So what happens if, for example, there is a water accumulation in a certain area of the house due to a leaky pipe or some other infusion where water is getting in where it's not supposed to be, and there's a certain smell that comes from the carpet, or there's a certain discoloration that you find on the wall, that in fact might be mold. And so it's incumbent on you to go and inspect. And if upon your inspection, you find there's an accumulation of mold, it's because water is getting somewhere where it does not belong. And whether that's the negligence of the tenant who is just spilling water all over the place, dropping water on carpeted areas or in closets somehow, leaving wet clothing for long periods of time, that moisture creates this mold problem. And if that's happening, you need to know what the tenant is doing and then that the tenant has corrected that behavior. Now, some of it is behind the wall. So if this has nothing to do with tenant negligence, then you have a duty to go and find that out. So part of your inspection might include taking somebody with you to inspect the premises to make sure you don't have a plumbing problem. Many times mold incidents are issues having to do with a broken pipe behind a wall where water is slowly dripping. And maybe it's a small problem at first, but I guarantee you that putting a little white paint over it is not going to fix the water intrusion problem. The fact that you've covered up the problem doesn't mean you fixed it. And anytime you have a leak like this behind a wall, it's going to get worse if you don't actually address that problem. So if you get a complaint, address that complaint. And if you can point to the tenant, have them correct the behavior. But if it is a matter of the structure is in defect, get in there, cut a hole out, fix the pipe, patch that hole up, and don't deal with and remedy the source of the mold. That's always the biggest issue. Can you address the source? Landlords, as always, we welcome you to follow us on our Instagram page. If you're not a member yet, join us on Facebook. And if you enjoy what you see here, give us a thumbs up. Click that like button. We enjoy that very much. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Now, many times tenants are going to say, oh my gosh, I could have gotten so sick from this. I could have experienced all these things But the truth is, unless they actually were sick, there is no cause for a lawsuit. And I know you may have gotten some distress call or distress email from your tenant saying, well, I've got all these babies in my house and they could have gotten sick, or maybe they were sick and I believe it has to do with mold. So now you're having to contend with a little bit of science. And so what I always tell landlords when they're confronted by tenants who have these mold claims or mold accusations is, number one, did anyone actually get sick? If the answer is no, the conversation stops. Once you have remedied the source of the moisture, this is no longer a reason for you to be concerned about the presence of mold. But number two, if there is an incident where someone says, look, I was having headaches, I was feeling nauseous, I had these symptoms, and I actually went to a doctor. The second question is, did the visit to the doctor connect the dots? So we've had all sorts of cases over the course of my experience here as an attorney handling real estate matters for landlords. And I had an incident multiple times where people who have pre-existing conditions want to say that the mold made the condition worse. And I get it. You're going to have tenants that come to you with some serious illnesses and go to the doctor on a pretty repetitive basis. But unless that doctor can prove, or unless the tenant can prove that the mold itself caused a problem or exacerbated the problem, they just don't have evidence that the mold that was present on your property was in fact toxic in any way. Many molds are just not. Again, you walk outside in the city of Houston right now and take a deep breath, you're likely to breathe in mold. That doesn't mean that it's going to kill you. It could irritate your nose, it could irritate your throat, could irritate your eyes. That doesn't necessarily mean it's overall harmful. Now, if the mold inside your house is at a significantly higher level than the mold outside of your house, then there is a problem which can be proven scientifically. But again, unless there's a mold test that shows otherwise, or a doctor's report that indicates that a sickness or symptoms were caused highly likely due to the presence of mold, I don't know that you have a whole lot to worry about, particularly with people who have pre-existing conditions. Again, we've had people with all sorts of pre-existing conditions sue landlords and claim that the mold made it worse, but were unable to connect the dots, or unable to say, well, mold led to this condition, or mold made this condition worse. So you deal with the source, you find out if anybody was actually sick, and if they were sick, you find out if there's any causal link between the sickness that was experienced by the tenant and the actual presence of mold on the property. And we're thinking about this in terms of a lawsuit. If someone's going to make the claim that you caused them illness, or that your property caused them illness, they have to be able to connect the dots. They have to first say that they weren't the cause. And if they were the cause, that's a huge plus for you, because their negligence can't cause them injury that you have to pay for. But if it turns out that the defect was on the property, and that you didn't take reasonable steps after notice to fix it, and that the defect caused mold to appear, and that mold caused their illness or exacerbated their illness, then yes, you potentially have a valid claim against you, which is why we always go right from the start to the source, figure that out first, remedy it, so that none of these other things happen afterwards. Right? So someone has to be exposed to a lot of mold for an extended period of time, and either A, they're not telling you about it, or B, you're not dealing with it. I don't think that those of you specifically gathered here today are going to be the ones who just aren't going to deal with it. There are some landlords who just refuse to take care of stuff, but you guys are here because you want to be responsible and proactive. And this is the way you handle these situations. Find the source and then investigate whatever the claims are that your tenant might make having to do with causality. Can they show that they were actually sick? And if so, can they show that that sickness derives specifically from the mold that was found in your home? Chances are it's going to be unlikely, especially if you're catching the source quickly.